Okay, guys, in the tradition of bringing people who shake up academia, I've got for you a big fish today, another big fish on this show. Rachel Fulton Brown is a professor, associate professor of history at the University of Chicago. Uh, Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
I'm going to just give a bit of a.
You came out from under the table. Well done.
I was going to mention this. Please, I know that you're a very scary Nazi white supremacist. I'm from Lebanon. I'm Jewish. So I was terrified. I even asked my wife if I should do this. Are you going to cause me harm? But I had the testicular fortitude to come out of the table. So please be gentle on me.
That's because you went bowling, right? It got you going.
All right. So here's some of your interests: history of Christianity, medieval European culture, religious and intellectual history, liturgy and prayer, devotion to the Virgin Mary, scriptural exegesis and hermeneutics, subcreation and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Am I pronouncing him right?
Tolkien, yes.
Tolkien, okay, great. Some of your books include From Judgment to Passion, Devotion to Christ and the Virgin Mary, 1800 to 1200, then History in the Comic Mode, and then Mary and the Art of Prayer, The Hours of the Virgin in Medieval Christian Life and Thought, and many other writings and many other appearances. So what I thought we would do is start off with a discussion of your work, again, coming from someone who's not an expert in your field, and then we'll get into some of the stuff that sort of got you into severe trouble with some of your colleagues. How does that sound?
Well, I'm working on getting myself into more trouble with my scholarship. So starting there is a good thing.
Okay, so I guess the first thing we could talk about is, do you, and I'm sorry if I ask, I hope it's not too personal. Do you think that your scholarship is affected by whether you, as the scholar, are religiously devoted to what you study, or could you be could it be me, who's an ardent atheist, yet I can engage that scholarship and hopefully come out with similar conclusions as you might have?
I hope you would come out with similar conclusions that I might have, because the first thing that you need as a scholar is imagination. And it's interesting to me. That's how I start my Mary and the Art of Prayer. That devotion is an exercise of the imagination, right? It's putting yourself into a place that you might not be able to see otherwise. I start with Elaine Scarry's work. You may know her work from In Body and Pain, and she has this wonderful meditation on the way in which pain is the thing that has no referent other. It's completely subjective, right? If you're trying to describe your own pain to someone, they have no clue, right?
Psychological pain, spiritual pain, physical pain, all of it?
Well, she starts with the body, and are you familiar with her book? It's from
Really.
The 80s, the mid 80s. That she started with, the problem of things like torture, and the way in which pain is the place at which language breaks down, right? That pain, when the first thing you can do to express it is just say "ow," right? That there's no language. There's this exclamation. There's in fact no ability to describe it. And it's in that exercise of trying to describe it that, in her argument, you start moving out of the pain, right? You move into being able to describe something, right? But it's always never the pain itself. And she has this understanding that because pain is the single most subjective thing there is, that it's a work of imagination to move yourself out of it. And the first thing you might think was imagination. My opening line in Mary and the Art of Prayer is devotion, like imagination, requires an object, and that, by which I mean, she points out that what you imagine the imagination to be depends on what you think the imagination is holding in its understanding, right? So you say imagine a unicorn, you think of imagination as something that's dealing mainly with unreality, right? But if you're hungry and suffering pangs of hunger and imagine food, what imagination is your motivation, right? It's the thing to say things could be different, right? Things could be different from what they are now. And that's why I'm saying, but religious belief is an exercise like, that's partly imaginative. She also has a nice discussion of the way in which imagination and belief are interconnected, that you are um, giving yourself a kind of frame to understand your experiences within. And you started by asking whether you as an atheist could do this. What I say also in the opening of Marrying the Art of Prayer is that you are already in a frame, whether you're aware of it or not, right? You are framing your understanding as a scientist or as a, I don't know what you mean, but when you say you're an atheist, I have to imagine myself into your perspective. See,
I don't believe in a deity.
Okay, so there you have a particular understanding of the world, and I say I, as a Christian, have a different understanding, and as a Christian, I see it as my I guess responsibility, the necessity of my work as an intellectual to try to show you the frame that I'm working from within, and that would be a kind of imaginative exercise that, if I can show it to you properly, I invite you to the possibility that what I've shown you is real. Likewise, you say, as evolutionary psychologist, looking at the practice or experience of faith, would have another way of explaining it. And then we, in conversation, would try to persuade each other.
Do you think that one could be moral without having faith? And the reason I say this is because that's one of the last places where, the God of the gap arguments is still valid, where people say,
right,
oh, we can now explain opposable thumbs using evolution. We can explain the evolution of your pancreas, but morality, that can't be explained via evolution. Of course, other than the 13 trillion studies that have done exactly that. So I think the religious mind, and I'm not suggesting you do this, but the religious mind usually says, oh, no way, morality is off limits. No way could science ever explain this. And I usually satirize this by saying, were it not for my having interacted with the Torah, the Jewish, the Old Testament, I would have been running around now decapitating puppies and raping their headless corpses. But it's only because I did my bar mitzvah that gave me the guidelines to not do so. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you just satirized yourself, and I actually agree with your satire. I do think our religious teachings undergird more of our morality than the argument that you're suggesting you actually hold to would suggest. That this is a simplistic version of things, and it's coming from something that I've been reading recently by Nancy Pearcey in a book that she's trying to describe art and the way in which in Western culture we've divorced the possibility that art can show truth or reality from scientific understanding, and she talks about this fact value division that we've been working with since the Enlightenment, that science or the empirical or the material suggests one kind of truth that we can test through our senses, through observation, through scientific modeling, which is different from that which we value, that which we think of typically. Morals typically go in the value box, right? That there are things that we think are worth having in human experience. And with that 18th century division between the subjective and the objective, it does seem to suggest that morality tends to fall in the subjective box. And I don't think you would agree with that, right?
No.
I think probably you would say no, morality is actually objective and grounded. But I would disagree with you that it's simply by an evolutionary argument that we can make it. I was watching the video that you did on the professor who wrote that New York Times piece on being a male feminist.
Oh my goodness!
I agree with you utterly on that one.
Before you start, let me just tell the people who haven't watched it. I receive endless emails in a given day, and so by the end of the day, I'm exhausted because sort of the weight of the world has been pushed on me yet for another day. And so I received an email from a female professor. I think she's a neuropsychologist. I can't remember exactly, or neuropsychopathologist. I can't remember the details. And the reason I mentioned she's a female professor because she was just so angered by that article. She said, please, Dr. Saad, if you have a moment, please read it and weigh in. And so, as I often do, I dropped everything, read it, and I was so aghast that my family was calling me for dinner, and I put together that clip while they're waiting, upset at me that dinner is getting cold. But anyways,
well,
take it
that's
away.
why you had such fire in it. I couldn't tell when you were reading it whether it was parody.
Exactly.
Right? I'd say, does he think this is actually, anyway, you make a very good point in that analysis that, men are capable of what I would say very virtuous actions, right? They're capable of compassion. They're capable of courage. They're capable of, great intellectual reasoning, and they're also capable of being quite evil. They're capable of being violent. They're capable of being envious and prideful, and well, whether anger is fundamentally a vice or not is problematic. Those are all, it's like those are all capacities that we have evolved as human beings, right? That our full range of abilities to be both nurturing and supportive and caring are balanced in evolutionary terms by our capabilities to be envious and spiteful and murderous and violent. And as you rightly pointed out, both men and women are utterly capable of both, right? It's like to decide to gender virtue as feminine and vice as masculine is utterly idiotic. But the problem, I think, morally is, so in evolutionary terms, we're all of those things, right? I actually have done, certainly not as much as you, tiny bit of reading and evolutionary psychology. I read Tubi and Cosmides' great collection back in the early aughts, and some of my friends were very, very dismissive of me. Oh, Rachel, those are just
Nazis,
just so stories.
Oh yeah,
right?
of course.
The problem is you can explain anything with this, and what I like about it is the understanding that if you want to understand human nature, you need to understand absolutely everything that people have done, and that includes everything people have done, right? There's deciding whether or not being savage or civilized is more or less human. Well, both, right? And that's why I think figuring out why we choose certain behaviors over others, that's a more complicated problem.
So what are the methodology that you use in your work? And again, I'm asking this question from the perspective of someone who follows, adheres to the strict scientific method. There's a hypothesis.
Right.
I develop some data collection procedures. I conduct some data analysis. Now, of course, I know that many historians do abide to the scientific method, and that's why I get very upset when people say, "Oh, but sociologists are not scientists," or historians are not scientists. A scientist is someone who applies the scientific method. You could apply it in physics. You could apply it in sociology. The reason why sociology might at times be a bunch of gibberish nonsense is because it allows for greater infusion of ideological biases, and therefore sociologists are more prone to not adhering to the scientific method. But there's nothing epistemologically speaking that doesn't allow a historian or a sociologist to be a working scientist. Now, but I get the feeling that in your case, that's not the approach you take, right? You're not proposing a hypothesis which you go out, collect data, and then test it somehow. You're using some other mechanism. What do you do?
Well, I would say I do that.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Because in the sense that I say, so Marrying the Art of Prayer, it's saying there's this prayer practice that I know was very popular in the later Middle Ages because of the number of books we have that supported that practice. If you've ever seen a medieval manuscript, you've probably seen what we call a Book of Hours, because the Books of Hours often have very beautiful illustrations, particularly ones that people like putting on Christmas cards because there's nativities and the visit of the Magi and things like that. But these Books of Hours, we know that there are tens of thousands of them that still survive. It's like if you could read in the later Middle Ages, you probably learned to read using one of these books. So you say, is that scientific to say the thing that I need to understand about this culture is the thing that seems to have been most prevalent in people's literary life? And, since as a historian, your primary evidence is written, not because we can't use other kinds of, material survivals. And that's what we have, right? If you're a historian, what you have are things that still survive that people made in the past, right?
I call these, by the way, fossils of the human mind.
I like that. So, but they're fragments and traces of people's previous activity, right? And so I say, well, if they're one of the most, if they left this massive set of examples of their previous activity, which was reading this particular set of texts, okay, then I want to understand it, right? And so I say, because that's a hypothesis, this mattered to them. Now, obviously, I can only say it mattered to them. Then as historians, we start saying, well, how much did it matter to them? Well, you could study those books by saying, I start with, say, how many there are, right? Or another interesting feature of the Hours of the Virgin is that it's not a single text. It becomes a single text after the 16th century, after the Council of Trent, when what we call the Catholic Church now answers to the Protestants, what we call the Protestants now, sort of reaffirming the tradition that Christianity had developed out of. And one of the things that after Trent they do is try to standardize a number of their prayer texts. And so the Hours of the Virgin becomes something that's apparently sort of fixed, right? But in the Middle Ages, there are hundreds of different versions of it, right? It seems to be a very local practice that, particularly in France, say every diocese, every local city would have its own version. Different religious orders have their own versions. So it's my next piece of evidence, right? One, there's lots of books of it. Two, it seems to have been adapted to the sort of individual prayer practices of different regions and different communities, which suggests it's something that people want to do, right? So, okay. And then you might go further and say, well, okay, there's lots of books. Did people use them? That gets tricky because most of the ones that survive are the ones that were precious in other ways, right? They were very beautiful pictures. They were very beautiful pictures. That tends to be what people know about them. So we don't actually know, say, how many there were just sort of ordinary, right? Except for we do know that many, many copies of them, once the printing press comes into being, were made, and that they're after the books that were used for saying the office itself, the big prayer practices that all the clergy and monastics would be involved in. It's like the second most printed version of a book ever in the late Middle Ages. Those are lots of pieces of evidence.
Even more than my books?
I can't hear you. Even more than...
No, because you said the second most printed books, and so I just jokingly said they're printed even more than my books. Forget it. It's a joke.
I'm sorry, Gad. Yes.
You gotta stay with the humor. Let me give you an example. Come on, put on your.
Oh, you got me down in my work. Sorry. Then I get serious.
Step out of it.
Okay, but that's a good example of my method. So come back to that.
So here's an example of what I would consider sort of a historical analysis rooted in a strict scientific method. So let me give you an example, and it actually comes from history. So there is the Darwinian historian Laura Betzig. Do you know who she is? No. Laura Betzig, I think at one point was associated with the University of Michigan. I think now she might be an independent scholar. Betzig, Betzig. And at one point, she published a paper. Now you might say, what is a Darwinian historian? And you'll see in a second. And so she looked at the Old Testament. So this is right within your wheelhouse. Generally in terms of religion. She looked at the status of male protagonists in the Old Testament and then associated them to how many women they have. So, for example, a general or a king might be associated with a greater number of women, and a peasant or certainly a slave would have fewer. The reason why she was doing this is because there's a lot of course, research in evolutionary psychology that basically says that the variance of reproductive fitness of men is tied to their social status, and so the higher social status you have, the greater your reproductive fitness by virtue of the fact that you are able to instantiate greater sexual interactions with more women. And therefore she took that principle and said, well, let me exactly test this idea using the Old Testament as the source material. And so then she has a very specific hypothesis. She goes into the Old Testament, she does a content analysis and quantifies all of the information, and then comes out with a statistical analysis that either disproves or not, or refutes or not, the hypothesis. So this is what I mean by applying, a strict application of the scientific method. Does that give you a sense?
Okay, so yes, and there I'd say that's where I was getting to. So you asked me whether I set up with evidence, and I said because that's my kind of evidence. But then there's this problem of you're already. I mean, what you're suggesting that she did was it's already a problem of interpretation that. So I'm trying to figure out why people read these texts and how many of them there were, and then you get to the point. Well, you're always dealing as a historian. Well, history is actually making moral judgments constantly. And you said something like, so people say sociology isn't scientific because it makes an ideological claim. Well, the human sciences, those fields in which we study each other human beings, we are always making moral judgments. Ideological is I think a sort of weasel word for saying you're making a moral judgment, right? And the problem with that is because you're always trying to judge the value of whatever people are doing. Also, so you've thrown a lot of different things at me. Let me think. I'd say Betsick is using the Old Testament as if it's a straight transcript of reality, and of course it's not. It's stories that were put together to make a particular point, and therefore we, as I say, as a historian, I mean, once you've decided whether a text is important to the culture that you're studying, then you figure out how to think about it, right? It's like if it's a text that only there's only one copy of from the Middle Ages. Well, this is a very specific view of one person, one community. It's hard to say exactly whether that's terribly widespread. With the books of hours, I can say, well, but it seems like everybody knew this text and everybody was reading it. So likely the texts in this practice affected people's imagination. They affected the way they saw the world. I mean, the Old Testament is obviously a good example for a text that's deeply affected people's imagination and the way they see the world. Whether we can use it as, a census of the patriarchs and their families, probably not, because it's not meant to be a straight transcript of how many people were alive at the time and who had which families and how many there were. It's certainly significant that the storytellers valued people like Jacob having 12 sons and gave them a story, but that we can't statistically model whether or not that's likely, right? When you were talking, I was thinking of Charlemagne, who had multiple wives, I think 8. There's a joke. It's like the entire nobility of medieval Europe was one way or related to Charlemagne.
Or Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan
did even better. I think most of Asia is related to Genghis Khan. That most of Europe ends up related to Charlemagne in one way or the other. So yes, it is true that very powerful men have often been able to have many children, but some fairly powerful men didn't. Henry VIII. Who had some problems with not having a lot of children. He had lots of wives and not enough children. So I think the thing to understand when we're dealing with history is you're always dealing with texts that were written for a particular purpose at a particular time to make a particular point. And therefore we as readers in the present have to be mindful of that in when we come into it and interpret what it is that what the text is trying to show us, right? And so you asked me what my method is. That I, in Marrying the Art of Prayer, I said I use this story that C.S. Lewis told about his own sort of moment of understanding of what it's like to have see with faith as opposed to seeing with a different I don't want to use the word ideological because that makes it sound like it's a bad thing. It's just a thing. You're seeing with a particular perspective. So. Lewis, one day, he's in his tool shed, he says, and the door's closed and it's dark. And there's this beam of light streaming through the top of the door that sort of streams into the darkness that he's standing in the tool shed. And standing outside the beam, he says he can see the beam. He can see dust motes dancing in it and so forth, but he can't see anything else. He can just see the beam of light. And then he steps into the beam and the light hits his eyes, and you recognize the metaphor is a quite religious metaphor because we see with the light of Christ. So it's not accidental that he takes this metaphor, but the light hits his eyes, and looking along the beam, he says he could see, the through the crack in the door to the leaves on the trees dancing in the sunlight, and then 93 million miles away, the sun, right? And so, and he uses that as a metaphor to say we see different things depending upon the interpretive perspective that we're taking outside of the beam. In terms of religious faith, is like looking at it as a psychologist might, or a sociologist, or an anthropologist, right? You can say all sorts of things about people's behavior, the words that they use, you know, make hypotheses about their motivation. Say it's because of their you know, physiological state. It's because of their social interactions. It's because of the culture that they're in. But when you step in it, you see things that you can't see from the outside. So, and this is the problem for those of us who are writing about faith. Say, I can show you what the Christians that I'm studying read in those books, but only if you can sort of imaginatively step inside with me and look along the beam to the vision that they're trying to show you. Now, in sort of missionary terms, that should be your ideal method, right? It's like, step in with me. I'm going to describe the exegesis, the interpretive framework that they're using, and help you appreciate why it is that that's a sort of possible reality. Now, inside and outside that beam, I mean, both are valid in terms of things that you can learn from them, but you see different things depending on the perspective that you take.
Tell me what you think of this, and then we could, after this, move on to some of your recent trials and tribulations. So
are you starting to understand why I may have those trials and tribulations?
Well, I think the audience will find out why you're having them in a few minutes. It'll be abundantly clearer. But yes, I hear you. So there's a field called literary Darwinism. Because what I'm trying to do is, you know, I'm a huge consilience guy, trying to create unity of knowledge, trying to a true interdisciplinarian. So whenever I speak to a guest, I'm always trying to think of ways by which their intellectual realities and their intellectual landscapes might have bridges to mine, where we can sort of go back and forth seamlessly. And so a lot of the gist of my questioning comes really from that ethos. So there's a field called literary Darwinism, whereby instead of using a Marxist lens or a feminist lens or a queer lens or fill in the bullshit other lens, you use an evolutionary analysis to study literary narratives. So, you know, there's a few fundamental driving plot lines in any literary narrative that everyone can relate to. This is what allows me to study an ancient Greek poem and completely understand what the guy is feeling, despite the fact that we live in very different times and in very different cultures. We are operating using the same software of the mind. So this speaks exactly to my idea, what I call fossils of the human mind. Human minds don't fossilize because the mind is organic, but the products that they leave behind do fossilize. So therefore, I could take religious narratives and study them using the way Betzig did, or the way I do for many cultural products like song lyrics, and study their content, because they do say something very non-subjective about human nature. There are commonalities that I will find in all of these cultural creations, precisely because they were created by folks who share a biological heritage with me. So to take another example that you're interested in, since you study chivalry and so on, troubadours, the things that they sang about are exactly those that are sung about today in hip-hop songs. The style is different, the linguistic delivery is different, but there is no song, whether it's from troubadours or songs by hip-hop artists today, that say the following: "Hey Linda, you're gorgeous, but you have too low social status, so I'm not going to have sex with you." That song doesn't exist because it is contrary to human nature. It is contrary to the ear of the listener. And that's why the troubadour is actually the same thing as the hip-hop artist. So is it possible for me to engage the religious narratives that interest you, but using a completely non-subjective, or objective evolutionary lens? Do you think that that would lead to additional explanatory power to whatever interests you?
So I'd say what you're doing, this is great conversation because you're basically pushing me on the edge of the thing that my new work right now, which is thinking about virtues and vices, which is why your question, I mean, sort of the morality of what we're studying matters to me, whether or not you can have morality without faith, which I don't think you can, but I think that's a longer conversation than we're going to have this morning. That what you're just okay, so there's two things in there. What you're describing in the hip hop carrying on with the troubadour mode, to my argument as a historian, is that's a historical continuity of particular kind of love song, right? That is crafted with a particular understanding of the proper relationship between men and women, which I would sort of, chivalry and courtly love are possibly two distinct but interrelated understandings, but that cultural expectations do shape our moral understanding, and that's to go back with, I think your morality is more informed by your Torah studies than maybe you're letting yourself realize. And so, for example, when you're giving the example of, whether it's appropriate for men to have lots and lots of wives or only one, as in fact ultimately in both Judaism and Christianity, that you cleave to one man, one woman. That's a moral teaching that we have from the scriptural tradition, and is an expectation of a particular kind of relationship between a husband and wife that it goes completely against the claim that it's appropriate for the strongest and most virile and most powerful man to get as many women as he possibly can. Now, they may be attracted to him, as certain very prominent, one example springs to mind, men sometimes recognize that if you are very rich and very powerful and command a lot of authority, women are going to be attracted to you. But within the Jewish and Christian tradition, the model is, but you only get one wife, right? And we try to hold each other in that tradition to fairly strict standards. So which is it? Is that culture or evolution? Now, I've seen evolutionary arguments saying, monogamy is the way to the development of civilization, because if you don't allow most men to have a wife because the one guy is getting all of them, you end up with a very unstable social situation, because you have a lot of young men who are never having a hope of a wife, because the one guy, Genghis Khan, is going to get absolutely all of them. The rest of you guys have to go be murderous thugs. So, that monogamy is actually a balancing and civilizing cultural practice. Is there an evolutionary argument for it? Well, which, right? And that's what that's why it's problematic, because I totally agree with you about we as human beings have access to anything that other human beings have created by way of our appreciation of them as human beings, right? So whether it's a story, it's a troubadour poem, or it's a Chinese novel, or whether it's I've been thinking about Australia recently for other reasons, a particular practice that the Aborigines have. We as human beings should be able to step into their perspective and understand why they're doing it using our imagination, which is another of our human faculties. But that doesn't mean that the reason the hip hop singer is not favoring women of low status doesn't have also a cultural and moral underpinning.
I would just say that, cultural realities exist not contra biology. They exist in their form because of biology. So the idea that, we should also offer cultural explanations for something, that doesn't disprove that it wasn't due to biology. There is no culture, there is no religious narrative that I'm aware of, certainly not the Abrahamic ones, that place greater premium on male sexual chastity than on women. Now, that could be because coincidentally all of the various gods came up with the same revelations and so on, or edicts, or it could be that it is a very clear manifestation of a very basic Darwinian principle, which suggests that men and women don't have the same costs of making a poor mate choice. Therefore, there's a premium on women being more sexually judicious. And therefore, that religious teaching, that cultural learning, that parental socialization exists in its form because of biology, not as an opposite explanation to biology. You follow what I'm saying?
Yes, and I agree with you there. Right. So I think I mean that's indeed back at the beginning of the project of the Mary and the Art of Prayer book. I read in some of, as I said, in some of the evolutionary psychology of religion, to try to see at what point I could draw on it. And I mean, as a historian, the problem is it's like your prospect as an evolutionary psychologist is everything human, right? And mine is understanding a particular culture and period. And so I accept everything you're saying about the biology. Yes, we are physically, biologically certain kinds of creatures, which is a theological word. And the challenge, as you know, as a historian of religion and also as someone of faith, is to understand whether or not they're better or worse ways of living, and that then it becomes immediately a moral argument, right? And I think the reason, for example, sociology is ultimately, in fact, a moral project is because it is trying to make claims about better and worse social arrangements, ultimately, right? And Christian Smith's Sacred Project of American Sociology is excellent on that, saying sociology is ultimately a religious project. That's why it feels ideological. It's actually because it's a moral project and making very specific kinds of moral arguments.
Right. Last question about your work, and then we move on to what pushed you to become a white supremacist Nazi bigot. And for anybody...
Wait a minute! Get back under the table now. I will not believe that you think that unless you're hiding.
I'm feeling actually quite safe in the presence of such a Nazi bigot. So apparently, you're not clearly as dangerous as Dorothy Kim makes you out to be. I despise the fact that I know of her existence. I feel existentially polluted by knowing that she exists. Let's see her come after me, because my oppression Olympic score is much, much higher than her. Come after me, Dorothy. But anyways, in my case, and in the case of many evolutionary, behavioral scientists, evolutionary psychologists, they can point to that epiphany, that moment when they were bitten by the evolution bug. And I won't repeat what mine was because the viewers have heard it a million times. It was basically a book that had been assigned in a course in my first year as a doctoral student. In your case, what do you have an epiphany from, at some point that said, aha, this is what I'd like to spend my intellectual capital studying? Do you have a similar story to tell? Is it because you were religious as growing up as a child that led you? What's your epiphany story, if you have any?
Well, I was religious growing up, but I was Presbyterian, not Catholic. And I did have I always have more than one epiphany. Mine are usually fairly layered. I think one of them may have been getting to be Mary in the nativity play at our church. Another, and you could say this is a kind of interesting sort of moment, was reading the prophecy from Isaiah, which I read as a prophecy of Christ, of his titles, right? That he's Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God. Now I'm forgetting the third one because my dog is barking.
Your dog is not happy with what you're saying, apparently.
My dog is not happy with what I'm saying. Prince of Peace, right? Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And I have these. I'm sure you as a teacher have had these experiences. You're reading something out and it just hits you, right? And I got to read that out when I was 13 or 14 in church, and I can look back on it and say I've been trying to understand those titles ever since, right? I've been trying to understand who God is, what those titles refer to. Another sort of moment of understanding. I was in my second year in college. I was a religious studies major, and I was in a course on the Western tradition, and we were doing little meditations on Christianity. And I was in a philosophy class that I wasn't that impressed by because these guys were from Cambridge and they had these funny accents. But they were doing a lot of sort of hypotheticals about hypothetical persons and whether or not, if you aborted a child, whether or not that hypothetical person was injured and da-da-da-da. I somehow was not taken with it. And I was meditating instead on what wisdom was. And what it meant to long for wisdom, what it meant to find wisdom, where wisdom was. And I had this sort of reverse, sort of retrospective epiphany when I finished the book on Marrying the Art of Prayer, that it was the answer to that longing, right? To understand wisdom, what it looks like, how you experience, how you come to it. And in the tradition that I'm working with, Mary is the mother of wisdom. She is filled with wisdom. She's filled with all knowledge of the sciences, with all knowledge of law, with history, with the understanding of the angels, with the understanding of the works of creation, because she gave birth to the Creator into the world. And that was, I was not fully aware of that as the thing I was looking for when I started the book on prayer. I thought I was looking for a kind of practical problem of what is it like to pray? What is it like to put yourself into this position of concentration? What is it, the attention that you're using? That I came out with this appreciation of what it means to see the world as a creation and to understand the incarnation as God's entering into that creation through one of his creatures, and that she was filled with the knowledge of all creation, and what that must have been like to pray with that understanding in the Middle Ages. It was a pretty intense moment. So you could argue with me whether or not I'd sort of imagine myself into it. It's like authors who imagine themselves into understanding their characters. Well, I would say that, that's the great religious tradition that we're always trying to appreciate. What is it like to be inspired and filled with the Holy Spirit, as Elizabeth was when she exclaimed that Mary is blessed among women. So that's layers.
Nice. All right. Well, we could certainly continue talking about this fascinating work and stuff for another 5 hours. Let's move on now to the troubled areas. I guess a few years ago, let me sort of summarize it, and then you'll take over. A few years ago, you wrote on your blog, three cheers for white men, or something to that effect, where basically you're saying, look, a lot of the stuff that we consider laudable today, women's rights, feminism, chivalry, all those sorts of things, stem from a certain tradition that ultimately has white men, guiding those realities, and that was viewed as terribly racist and bigoted, because contrary to what is an accepted progressive ethos today, which is to blame white men for everything, you had the audacity to say, but wait a minute, I think history is a bit more nuanced. There's a lot of wonderful things that white men have done. And therefore, all of these medieval scholars came after you based on that blog post saying that you're a white supremacist. Is that a roughly accurate summary?
Yes, that's fair.
Okay, and then since then, they've just been adding this. Is it one predominant person, Dorothy Kim, who is sort of the one who is instigating all this, or has she been able to, gather a sufficient momentum against you? Where are we in this story?
Well, right now we're post Milo in the story, in that he wrote a long piece this summer called Middle Rages that detailed the whole thing. And what I was thinking about it, and you also came across the story because Janice Fiamingo did a video about it. What I find interesting is that, Milo wants me to sort of move on from it now that we've told the story. And I understand that others don't. So I think, one of the things that is obviously difficult for this in academia is we are a disputatious culture, right? And so I put up that post, and my blog is Fencing Bear at Prayer. And the prayer part was also, that's embedded in the long project of understanding prayer and the experience that we've been talking about. That I obviously put up the post to be disputatious, right? We've been for the last 30 years in an academic climate in which dead white European males are the monster du jour, and you're supposed to hate them and say that we shouldn't be reading the things that they wrote because they're oppressive and so forth. And so when I wrote the post, it was just called Talking Points, because it was literally 3 little sentences and a meditation on freedom of speech as also a product of this tradition. And I called it 3 Cheers for White Men because I was pushing back against that we don't want dead white European males in our curricula anymore. And my 3 cheers were, that chivalry is a way of valuing women, that consensual marriage, and in fact the monogamy, the man and the woman, and that it's both of them have to consent to it, is also a product of this tradition and greatly strengthens women's relationship with men. And that politically women have the right to vote in the West, because the men who had the vote at the time voted to vote them the vote, right? So it was it was meant to say, look, the reason that you have these values of women should not be raped, marriage should be consensual, that women should be a part of the political situation, are products of this tradition that you, my colleagues in academia, say you love to hate. I made the post in June 2015, about 10 days before President Trump, before Trump announced his candidacy for presidency. And one of the interesting things that's played out in all of this is, of course, that whole label of white has completely changed in the past few years. That, that you're joking that I'm being called a white supremacist. That really wasn't part of the vocabulary. With the pre-Trump conversation was, hey, ho, ho, Western civ has got to go. And I was pointing out that, well, you white women, which is why I said kept saying white women benefited from this. You white women, pay attention. Those white guys actually have been supporting you all along. I mean, male feminists go back to the Middle Ages. If you want that they are the ones who recognized that, women made in the image and likeness of God, are actually human, and have souls and intellects, and therefore are worth respecting and valuing and cherishing, in the ways in which the storytellers from the troubadours on have described them. So those hip hop, if the hip hop singers are actually valuing women, they're in the tradition of the troubadours. So there you go. About 6 months after that, Professor Kim found this post in a project that she was working on called Digital Whiteness, and said, in this Facebook group called the Society for Medieval Feminist Scholarship, this is white feminism. I don't support it. It's basically white supremacist. Quite a few people at that point jumped in and said, oh my gosh, she's a professor. She's a professor. Where? Gasp. It's awful. Oh yes, she clearly is. She clearly is all of the things that we know we're supposed to hate. I came into that conversation, I thought, tried to explain myself. I've since realized that explaining myself was never going to be possible, because this group of colleagues is dedicated to a particular description of the tradition that they will not be able to let go of without undoing their entire interpretive framework. So I'm, in fact, I get it that I'm a threat to them. I am the monster that comes in and says that interpretive framework that you're using is a fantasy, right? There's nothing in what you say you're seeing that is justified by the actual evidence of either the sources that we're reading or the culture that we live in now that you say, was created by this older culture. But in those terms, it should have just been a typical academic argument of, well, I say the history developed this way, you say the history developed that way, we should be able to debate it out and test it on the basis of the evidence. I've since learned that they're not really interested in that. And they're much more interested in calling me names and calling me fascist and neo-Nazi and white supremacist than they are in understanding why I would think, on the basis of the evidence that I work with, their interpretation of the story needs revising.
Now, in my next book, which I'm currently working on, I offer, the whole raison d'etre of the book is really to explain how people's minds can be parasitized in the way exhibited by the people who've attacked you. Something that I call ostrich parasitic syndrome. So I look at a whole bunch of idea pathogens and how, in the same way that actual physical parasites can, parasitize an organism's mind, ideas can do the same thing. So I've got my own framework that will seek to explain why Rachel Fulton Brown would have gone through the experience that she did. But what's your explanation? I mean, what from your perspective, from your intellectual tradition, from your, I hate to use this sort of progressive term, lived reality, what is your explanation for why these people are so not only insane, but so blatantly intellectually dishonest? Do you think that at the end of the night, when they put their head on their pillow and in the deep recesses of their minds, they know that they are lying to themselves and to others? Or do you think that they genuinely believe the nonsense that they spew?
I don't know. I really don't know. Dorothy Kim did a piece in Inside Higher Education this summer that Milo also wrote a response to, suggesting that I have put her into actual physical danger.
But that's why I was hiding under the table, because I too was scared in the
right.
exact same way.
I don't know how she can actually believe that, right? I truly don't know how she can actually believe that, because she's saying that in public spaces, right? That she went to a conference this summer in Leeds in England, and she did a Facebook post before she went to that conference saying, you guys, I'm coming over to talk about fascism, and Milo Yiannopoulos is not to be trifled with. I demand that you, the Leeds International Medieval Congress, provide me with physical protection, because, these people are out to murder people like me, effectively. I don't think she used murder, but she's like, she did make this argument. Milo is not to be trifled with. Well, the conference provided no security for her, because why would they? And nothing happened. And she gave a talk in which she called me and Milo fascists multiple times. Right? I think she's sort of, we were aesthetic fascists, right? So on the one hand, she'll make these public pronouncements on social media that, take these threats seriously. These people are out to hurt me, and I've had to hide and protect my family and so forth. And yet stand up in public and say it again. Right. So, I really don't know. I mean, I don't know.
Let me propose to you one possibility that I think is, with all due modesty, absolutely veridical. This is a malady that I call collective Munchausen. So Munchausen syndrome, as you may know, is a psychiatric disorder whereby typically women will feign medical illness, medical injury, in order to garner sympathy and empathy. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is where you take someone who's under your care, your dog, your biological child, your elderly parent, you harm them in order to get empathy and sympathy. Well, I argue, stay tuned for my next book, I argue that all of these social justice warriors, all these intellectual terrorists, all of these enemies of reason have succumbed to a collective form of Munchausen, right? Her existence, her existential currency resides in the desperate need to convince everyone around her that she's a victim. It's not Descartes' I think, therefore I am. It's I'm a victim, therefore I am. And therefore, she needs to find that boogie person that requires for her to get protection, because I'm a victim. And regrettably for you, you turn out to be that victim. What do you think of that theory?
I can accept that. I mean, certainly it's. I mean, what's interesting is, of course, I appreciate that, because she came after me and started calling me names, and then, I mean, it did snowball. I've had a fairly exciting last couple of years. Most of it online, some of it sort of in the tension that I've experienced going to conferences and things like that, mainly so that I just, I show up and I say, hi, I'm here. And people are embarrassed, right? They're embarrassed that there's this whole flare up. They're embarrassed. I mean, unfortunately, I more of my colleagues seem to believe her than I would have expected, right? It ratcheted up when I started writing about Milo. And obviously, people, if they don't pay proper attention to him, they take a lot of the surface stuff that's said about him and the performances that he's made as, oh my gosh, he's actually truly is, dangerous. It's like, oh my goodness, no, he's not. He's laughing at you, which is different, right?
Before you go on, sorry to interrupt you. For those people who think that Milo is dangerous, I would invite them to live my childhood in the Civil War in Lebanon for exactly 14 seconds, then get back to me.
Right, Milo's not dangerous, and that anybody, and it's hard to say whether it's like whether they believe I'm dangerous, whether they believe he's dangerous. Like what we're doing is pointing to the fallacies in your argument, right? And that I'd say, I think a lot. So as we talked earlier when I'm talking about faith and framing and how you understand reality, that obviously both Milo and I come into the world and say those things that you're afraid of aren't real, right? That thing that you have grounded your entire emotional existence on is a fantasy. When people are confronted with a disruption of their sense of reality like that, horror is that's what horror is, right? If you think about the way, which I don't watch because I hate horror movies, but say you did watch horror movies, you start off with a sort of very ordinary situation, right? The suburban house. I mean, obviously, it's usually the family's just moved in, right? There's a suburban house, and it looks idyllic and peaceful, and it's going to be a home, and something comes in and disrupts that, and either the neighbors turn into, serial killers, or your house is built on a graveyard, and so they're ghosts. I did see Poltergeist, never again. That I think what people are experiencing when someone like Milo or I come on stage and say, that thing that you've been fighting against, invested your entire emotional existence in as your campaign to eradicate, is a fake, is a fantasy. No, they're not going to see us as, oh my gosh, it's a relief. They're going to say, you're a monster, right? And so I do think there's a powerful psychological reality that they're struggling with, and it's a kind of conversion problem, right? It's like if I'm able to convince you that indeed Mary is the mother of wisdom, and God, the world is creation, and we are creatures of God and loved and so forth. You could take it in a number of different ways. You could either be like feel it as an opening out into this whole new understanding that is quite blissful and joyful, or, and this is what I'm experiencing at the moment on some of my Facebook posts, you could see nothing but evil, right? And there are people that are looking at the kinds of things that I'm saying about Mary and saying, that's blasphemous, that's diabolical, that's you are going to hell for saying those things. And I'm like, wow, okay, I didn't expect that. But I should have expected it, because I am defining a new understanding, or redefining an old understanding that challenges people's perceptual convictions. I need to come up with some better vocabulary for that. So there was another question that you had embedded in there.
That's okay. We'll come back to it if it pops up.
Okay.
From the the little that I've seen you sort of engage some of the trials and tribulations that you're going through, you seem to do it with some humor, some grace, with some due restraint. Is it just that's just your personhood, and in other words, you're armed with the unique genetic combination of genes that allow you to handle it the way you do, whereas others might have gone to psychiatric help? And the reason I ask this is because I often get tons of people who write to me and say, I'd like to be engaged, but I'm afraid of this, I'm afraid of that. I mean, just yesterday, if I showed you the number of emails I've received from professors who say, Dr. Saad, you're my hero. Shh, please don't share this with anyone. that I think.
I saw you're killing the ostrich. They didn't know that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So how can we get? I mean, what is your secret to being able to face these incredible detractors that could be quite emotionally and psychologically harmful to you? Right? You're getting hit with a tsunami of hate. But yet you sort of come out of it. I mean, of course it affected you, but yet here you are, you're smiling, you're okay, you're fine, you're going on with your life. What is it? Is it the fact that you are a person of faith, that you could turn to that as your sort of protection, or is it your personhood that's your protection? Give us your secret as to how you're able to handle it with such grace.
Her.
Okay.
Well, so
it all goes back to Mary.
It always goes back to Mary.
Holy
but
moly.
what you have to, she's full of grace. You ask how I'm full of grace. I am actually a fairly melancholic person in terms of temperament. That I, and there's a lot of this on the blog too. There's a post there called Melancholy 101, and my mom read it. She's like, I'm so sorry you're feeling so bad. And I'm like, Mom, I'm trying to show you that actually temperamentally, I struggle with a lot of, things that fit with melancholy, right? That, I'm not, so in that sense, I'm not sanguine in the old Galenic thing, that I don't know if I'm naturally, or, I don't know, right? I don't know what my personality temperament, well, I feel more sanguine now. Anyway, that's not the point. I've trained for it. That one of the things you asked, I think the other question you were asking me is like, why my colleagues reacted the way that they have. Fencing Barrett prayer was a training in virtue for me to start with, right? It was, I'm a fencer. I'm actually a fencer, right? A sport fencer. And I struggled a lot, for many years with what you would say are vices, right? Envy, pride, sloth, all of them, right? I had the full 7 set, right? And particularly things like envy. You'd see someone who does better than you are, even though she's only been fencing as long as you are, and you're like, I just eaten up with this inability to be joyful for her as a competitor, to say, that's good on your part. I want to be there, blah, 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 blah. And through the blog, I sort of wrote myself through a lot of those emotions or vices, depending on how you think about it, to appreciate what it is to be caught up in that kind of, all that I can use is moral language. It's sin, right? It's what's pulling you away from God. It's what's pulling you away from being able to see that you are made in the image and likeness, and blessed, and gifted, and all of these things. And I say it was that training, right? The blog in the first several years is training in the primary virtues of understanding what the vices are. The training since then has been training as a happy warrior, as a conservative. One of the reasons, the first reason that I think people get most anxious, particularly intellectuals, is when they think they don't know something, right? And so if I say something about the history of Europe and you don't know it, and your response as an intellectual is to feel threatened by my knowledge, you're going to fight me, right? You're going to belittle my knowledge, or you're going to say something that, well, I don't know what I'm talking about. You're going to fall back on the things you know. That, well, I think we're not teaching people terrifically well as teachers to deal with that level of ignorance, right? It's like the more you know about anything, the more you're going to be, I think, humbled by the understanding that you know very little, and you're going to expand yourself. Maybe what we're dealing with is the problem of people's specialization, right? That you have to, as a graduate student, train into a field. If something comes at you from outside of that field that you're not practiced in coping with, your first response may in fact be rage, because that's protective, right? You're threatened, you're protective. Don't come after me with those things that I don't know. Why we in the academy have gotten to a place that we're not actually practicing, like you and me right now, right? It's, you come from evolutionary psychology. I come from the history of Christianity and the study of faith. You propose something. I say, well, no, that's not the way I would think it from my perspective. I propose something. You say, well, that's not the way I would think it from my perspective. Why can't we practice that more? And I said that in a piece that I did for the divinity school here back in February 2017, right after Milo's talk had been shut down at Berkeley, saying what we're experiencing on college campuses is a religious crisis, in the sense that people don't realize that they're arguing these fundamental positions. They're theological. I think social justice is a theological position. It's a position of claiming, that the only way to ensure that people are treated properly as human beings is to create a particular kind of society. If you resist that creation of a particular kind of society, you're on the side of evil, therefore we must fight you. That's not an analytical framework, right? Just neutral, right? That's a theological position that you're taking, which I say, well, I agree with you that people should be treated with dignity because we're all made in the image and likeness of God, and I think that that's why you have a particular position that you think people are defending, but I don't think that if you restrict people's free will in the way that you're blah, 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 that it's, and we can go there if you want, but that we in the academy are refusing to recognize that these, to have the sorts of debates that we need to be able to practice having our faith challenged. I think that's where a lot of the sort of ferocity and anger is coming. Now, they would be angry at me and say, oh, now you're calling us, atheists, or not atheists,
Dogmatic.
infidels or dogmatic or something like that. I'm like, yes, because I, as someone who's been challenged on my faith my entire academic career and practiced at figuring out how to explain it, right? You who have not been challenged on yours because it's been the one that everybody agreed on, don't have as much practice.
Right. Just a quick point about you, the social justice warriors as a form of religion. I think you're exactly spot on, and I'll be talking about this in my book. It is a form of religion because there are revealed truths that are unencumbered by contrary evidence, right? I mean, it's very difficult when you're speaking to a religious person to say, but let me show you this data, right? I mean, it's la la la. That's a revealed truth because it's a revealed truth. Well, the psychological mindset of social justice warriors is exactly that. So I think you're spot on. But to speak to your point about wisdom and people who are challenged when about things that they don't know about, that's another thing. And forgive me for it. I'm not trying to plug my own book, but just so that people kind of can get excited about what's coming. Epistemic humility is exactly what wisdom is, right? It's knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know, right? Which several people, I mean, Socrates talked about that, and Confucius talked about that, right? Now, in my case, when I walk into a room with very hostile people to my whatever I'm going to research, I walk with a chip on my shoulders because I know that I will slam you with so much evidence that is unassailable. But on the other hand, I also have this ability to be incredibly humble and honest about information that I don't know about, which is precisely what allows me to have conversations with people knowing full well that I'm going to be enriched by their knowledge, which I don't know a priori. That's why I think, in part, my show has been very successful, because I can sit with the theoretical physicist, I could sit with the medieval historian, and not be threatened by their superior knowledge on these fields. On the contrary, if I could take all of their knowledge and infuse it in my brain, I'd be that much happier for it. So I think there is an interplay between, so that now I'm answering in a sense the question that I asked you, how do you handle all the tsunami of hate? In my case, it doesn't come from the Virgin Mary. It comes from the unique combination of my personhood that on the one hand causes me to be righteously indignant against injuries to truth, but also has me possessing the epistemic humility to sit down and have conversations with people with whom I fundamentally disagree with on many important points, right? I don't share your religious heritage, but I'm not threatened by it. I don't think you're a bad person for holding those views. I think that in a world made up of different people, there's going to be heterogeneity of thoughts. And my God, that's a sexier world to live in. So I think, right? So
yes.
I think that's the bottom line, right? It's having an openness of spirit, a generosity of spirit that allows us to have conversations with people with whom we could fundamentally disagree with. And I think the reason why the social justice warriors and the Dorothy Kims aren't able to do that is because it's no different than doing a satire of Muhammad. It's the exact same response they're getting. But they don't have the ability to literally behead you. Therefore, they reputationally behead you. And inshallah, one day we could behead you in the square at University of Chicago. But until then, we will, tar and feather you, or feather and tar you reputationally.
Yes, and I do know that they're continuing to do that. I'd say we're disputatious. Academics should be disputatious, right? And you could say, it's also because of my fencing, right? It's like I did a post on the blog called "How to Be a Happy Warrior" back 2 years ago now, when I first engaged with Professor Kim, and there were a number of things that are significant there. One, you need to, I said, know everything, right? But that means you need to, read a lot, right? It's like, if you're going to be engaged in these kinds of conversations, you just have to read and read and read and read and read and talk to people and learn, right? Because, as I said, you'll experience threat most often when you're pushed to answer something that you have never thought about, right? And that, when I first started writing about political issues, I got some responses on my blog saying, well, what do you think about, in this list of things? I'm like, wow, I've never thought about any of those. I don't have any opinion on them. I mean, actively, I have passive opinions on most things, but I hadn't really thought them through. And to recognize that, when someone comes at you with what do you think about that? It's like, well, either you've thought about it or you haven't. If you've thought about it, hopefully you have thought it through. If you haven't, you say, I haven't thought about that yet. Let me go find out, right? And not respond defensively there. Another important thing to think of is you only learn. I think most, we have this model in the universities, we call it Socratic, but it's actually from the medieval universities of disputation, right? It's like you only really learn when you're challenged by a question that you then have to practice answering. And that dialogue, that give and take of, you ask me a question about what I think about evolutionary, I'm talking too fast. You ask me a question about what I think about evolutionary psychology. I have to think about it. I have to push that. I have to test it with what I know. That's what the universities in the European tradition were developed to do, right? Test, push. I think there may be a very Jewish element in there too, because
the Talmudic tradition does exactly that.
Right. Exactly. The sort of testing, exegesis is that, right? It's this conversation about what the text might mean. It could be this, it could be that. We test it, so forth. So you need to know everything, but you also need to welcome the questions. Welcome, honor your opponent, because he or she is the one that gives you the chance to practice, right? Develop your understanding. You do not get stronger if you don't have someone pushing back against you. But that engagement is often quite threatening, because you are being, to a certain extent, challenged. So you need to learn to manage your emotions under threat. And that is the main thing that I think we seem to have zero capacity to help students with now. I did a post, the very first post that I did talking about why I admire Milo was responding to the Trickly-Puff meme that was going around 2 years ago. Can
you explain what that is? I mean, I know what that is, but maybe some people don't know what
right.
it is.
So Milo and Christina Hoff Sommers and Stephen Crowder were at Amherst, Massachusetts, and Christina was speaking about the feminist myths. And this young woman in the audience was sitting there going, "Take your hate speech off this campus," with her fists. And
the visual is particularly alluring, isn't it?
Yes, take your hate speech off this campus. And she'd do it and then drink her drink and then do it again. And this was obviously because the internet turned into a little GIF. And I did a post called Some Advice to Trickly-Puff and Her Teachers, saying, the reason that we end up with people like this poor young woman are, one, that people do not practice sitting with their emotions. They don't understand how to deal with the anxieties that come up when you are in a situation of developing skills. And second, develop some skills, right? I think mainly what we're seeing on the college campuses is people who don't have the fundamental basics of intellectual work. They will therefore dispute me on that, but I say you have not practiced grammar, rhetoric, and logic to a degree at which you're comfortable doing it. The only reason you respond emotionally in those terms is because you haven't actually developed the skills to deal with the situation that you're finding yourself in, which is why you feel under threat.
And in your teaching, have some of the realities that you've been facing with the sort of the Kim et al. Story, has that seeped its way into your classroom? Do you get people who are uniquely hostile to you because they've been exposed to that? Or is there a clear demarcation that this is something that you sort of handle outside of your daily realities? Or has it seeped into everything that you do professionally?
I did have, back in 2017, when I came back to campus, immediately after starting writing about Milo, and that was the year of his tour, and people were more aware of my blogging than on campus, and apparently talked about me a lot. I did have some students in one of my classes who were hostile. But in the context of our classes, I mean, we just had our annual college faculty meeting at Chicago. The college is a subset of the university, right? And the college is the undergraduate teaching. Apparently, our acceptance rate is the highest it's ever been in terms of our applications. We had a 77% acceptance rate.
Wow.
Yes. Wow. It's like we apparently went up like 7 points in the last year. And according to our dean of admissions, the reason that students say they're accepting to come here is because you expect to come to Chicago to have real debate. So I say, whatever I'm doing, it's certainly not affecting Chicago in a bad way. And indeed is I've always considered proving us, right? If Chicago can't take me, well, nobody can.
Right.
But thus far, I've seen that indeed Chicago can handle me, and the students can handle me. And I'm doing a course this quarter on virtues and vices, specifically on virtues and vices. And one of the exercises that I'm doing is having the students look in the news for stories and then write reflections on them according to the medieval systems that we're looking at for each week, right? So we've looked at Prudentius' Psychomachia, which is the battle of the virtues and vices. We've looked at Gregory the Great's commentary on Job. So it's a long meditation on the meaning of suffering and how sin comes into that. We were looking this last week at some 12th century descriptions of virtues and vices. And the first, to set them up as an example, this was right after the Kavanaugh hearings, so everybody was thinking about it. So I brought in some tweets that some professors had written, one at Georgetown and one at Catholic University, and the one from Georgetown was the dean who, no, is that right?
Oh, is that the one we castrate them after their bodies are and we feed them to pigs?
Yes, I thought I might bring this up. So the one at Georgetown, yes, that was Christine Fair's.
Oh yes, I covered
look at
that.
This chorus of entitled white men justifying a serial rapist's arrogated entitlement. All of them deserve miserable deaths while feminists laugh as they take their last gasps. Bonus, we castrate their corpses and feed them to swine. Yes.
That's nice.
She's apparently on holiday right now because of that. And the other was Dean Will Rainford from Catholic, who had tweeted, Swetnick is 55-year-old, Kavanaugh is 52-year-old. Since when do senior girls hang with freshman boys? If it happened when Kavanaugh was a senior, Swetnick was an adult drinking with, and by her admission, having sex with underage boys. In another universe, he would be victim and she the perp. He lost his job immediately. That he had been dean and he resigned. And I brought those two tweets to set them up and say, okay, here's an example. Find the virtue and the vice in each one, right? And you could see when I put them up on the screen behind me. It's a little class. It's like 12 of us. But I put it up and everybody went, what are we going to do? And then they realized we are going to talk about it, right? That there's assumptions of virtue and there's performances of vice in both. And I wanted them to sort of unpack it and see how we can, I mean, obviously, in order to understand the medieval tradition, practice it by applying it to our own problems, but also to say, like, we are part of that tradition. The reason that Fair is able to say, it's evil of men to rape is we have a very long tradition of saying it's evil for men to rape in Western Christianity. Rainford is able to say, having sex with underage people is inappropriate is also part of our long Western tradition, because there's one that sex should be consensual, as the 12th century canonists defined marriage, and that there are, it should be after the age of reason. It should be, appropriate to, the understanding of these two people as individuals. All of those things come out, and in both tweets there were virtues and vices, right? And we completely calmly talked them through. Since then, one of my students even brought up Jordan Peterson, and nothing happened. So we've had discussions about Trump. We've had discussions about, climate change and global warming. You should be able to practice this. It's the whole point of a university setting, which is to have the classroom be the place in which you can have the dangerous arguments and work them through and practice them.
Speaking of vices, I noticed that in one of your pages on your website, you talk about your interest in the 7 deadly sins. In my never-ending quest to build interdisciplinary bridges, it might interest you to know that I've written about the evolutionary roots of the 7 deadly sins, but specifically as a lead-in to what I call dark side consumption. So things like pathological gambling, eating disorders, pornographic addiction, excessive suntanning. You could see how each of these maladaptive consumer realities are ultimately rooted in one of the 7 deadly sins. And so to build an evolutionary argument, I go back to the 7 deadly sins and I offer a Darwinian analysis of it. So maybe offline, we can speak about it, or I could send you some of that stuff. I think you might.
I love that.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
But see, then I just say, well, then you're just proving the reality of the moral understanding of sin.
Meaning that I'm only offering a materialistic explanation of something divine. Is that what you mean?
I know, just that because the divine is the real, then that you access it scientifically is appropriate.
Thank you, Jordan Peterson. But anyways, any projects that you're currently working on as we wrap this up? As I always tell all of my guests, because I only pick super interesting guests, I could keep you here for another 5 hours, but I'm sure you've got better things than to spend the whole day with me. What are some projects that you're working on that may not yet be public that you'd like to use this forum to maybe promote?
Well, my current project is promoting Mary and the Art of Prayer, my book, because I've been working on that for a good decade, and and it just came out last November. So but recognizing that in fact, getting an argument about the significance of Mary to medieval culture, the significance of Mary to Christianity, the significance of Mary to women out into the conversation is proving more challenging than I expected. Although that's a little naive of me, since the book is specifically an attack on the feminist denigration of Mary from the 80s that I've been answering for a long time. And also, I think I'm getting a lot of pushback from Christians who do not recognize Mary's role in our understanding of ourselves, either as Christians or I say as human beings. But thanks to that book, I'm now moving into the study of the virtues and vices and thinking about the way in which this training and devotional practice is actually a moral practice, a training in virtue and vice. So I'm very interested in your evolutionary psychology argument of the vices. I want to talk to you about that. Things that you should know about me. The Fencing Prayer blog is my sort of ongoing meditations, and because I'm thinking about the virtues and vices now, I'm starting to write about that. I did a post on Judge Kavanaugh and his anger, right, and what you can see through the way in which a large number of law professors figured he had not the temperament to be a judge because he got angry, and I show through Aquinas how that is a rather disingenuous claim.
I make not Aquinas' argument, but I make a not an evolutionary claim, but a psychological claim for why he was perfectly justified to do it in my next book. So I'm with you.
Good. No, he was totally justified. And in fact, he was justified rationally, because anger is a rational response to having been attacked in the way that he was, and particularly for someone of good character, right? So we agree on that. So those are most of my projects sort of build on each other in those ways. So I'm working now on this morality and virtue and vice question.
Well, keep fighting. Keep showing us the way how to handle these enemies of reason with grace. An absolute pleasure having you with me. Stay on the line so that we can just say goodbye offline. Thank you so much for joining us, Rachel.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers. All right. Hi, guys. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Rachel Fulton Brown. If you appreciated this chat and the many other chats that I've held on the channel and all of the content that I provide you, please consider supporting my efforts through either my Patreon account and or my PayPal account. I provide you with links to both in the description section. Thanks, guys. Cheers.